Welcome to the HR Empowerment Podcast, where we will uncover strategies and new insights from HR professionals who discuss up-to-date regulations, best practices, and the most pressing topics like diversity and equity, leadership, dealing with difficult situations, and much more that affect your bottom line and business. Thanks for joining us.
Hey everybody, Wendy Sellers here, the HR lady. Thanks for coming back to HR Empowerment. I am here today with my co-host, JC.
Ms.
Hey, JC.
Wendy Sellers, thank you for the introduction. It's such a pleasure to hear your voice today, all the way from sunny Western Florida. Sunny Western Florida.
Yeah, I used to be in Central Florida,
That's
but
right.
I am in St. Pete, Florida now. And at the time of this recording, I'm headed out on vacation in the morning. I'm so excited. But before we do that, I do want to talk about something that people are like, oh, this is going to be so boring, but it's not. I promise you, it's important. We have an expert here today who's an expert in employment and income verification, which, you would think, who needs to know that? Well, if you're in HR in compliance and you're responsible for data, you definitely need to know that. So welcome to the show, Donny Phillips, Director of Partnerships from Vault Verify. How you doing, Donny?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks for having me on today, Wendy and JC. Really excited for the conversation today. And yeah, I think, on the surface, it does sound like it could probably be a little bit boring, but we'll hope that we avoid any level of boringness on today's conversation.
You know what? HR and payroll isn't always exciting to everybody, but many of us, including me, the HR lady, are very passionate about these items because if we get it right, we can save the company money, we can get amazing employees, and we can help people, succeed with their vision and, what they want to do in their life, and then hopefully retire, which is pretty much all of our goal, I think, sometimes. So talk to us a little bit about yourself before we jump in. Tell our listeners about you, Donny Phillips, where you're at and how you got to where you are now.
Happy to, Wendy. Again, I love hearing you talk about how you're passionate about the HR and payroll space overall. I think there's a handful of us sick individuals that get excited for these things as well. And what we're going to talk about today, I'm pretty passionate about. Hopefully it comes through in the conversation. But yeah, before we jump in here, so I am joining today from Central Ohio. Been home base for me for life, honestly. Have been in this outsourced HR payroll solution space for, I'm approaching 3 decades. Here later in Q4, actually, it'll be 29 years that I've been in this space. I've been around the block a couple of times. I've worked for some of the largest providers in the industry. I've worked for the world's largest third-party administrator over the course of my career. I've interacted with really employers of any size, shape, and makeup, ranging from the small mom and pop shops up to large enterprise national customers, even to federal government. So have a lot of experience across the whole breadth of customers and unique needs that may be out there.
I love that you also work with small businesses because I do think some small businesses don't realize that this topic is important. Just the concept. I mean, I'm an HR consultant. I help small businesses do a lot of things, including recruiting, and they don't usually realize, like, okay, reference checks is part of this as well, and they can go sideways. Not everybody tells the truth about reference checks on both sides of the spectrum there. So, before going sideways, which I often do, I want to talk about, just like the insights around employment and income verification, and how does the way a company handles income and employment verification affect the employee experience or the candidate experience in some cases in our now digital first workplace?
Yeah, I love that question, Wendy. Often in these conversations, we end up getting really focused on the impact to the employer team. So love the fact that we're starting with how does this impact the employees? So I would think, first of all, the employees need quick, accurate, and safe employment income verifications to be provided by either their employer or the vendor that the employer has outsourced this process to. And it's really it's to ensure that the employee doesn't get hindered in their pursuit of credit, whether it be, housing or a new car, or maybe they've applied for some type of government program. Not having an effective process in place could result in delays or inaccurate information going to those entities that the employee has applied for that credit or program with. It could impact them not getting the car that they're trying to buy, or being rejected from a housing application, or really any number of life event that may necessitate an employment or income verification. I would say that there's probably a couple of additional layers. So that's at the highest level, right? I think those are the key points that would impact the employee. But I think there's some maybe considerations that aren't quite as visible to the HR community today. And I think I would start with saying, that there's probably concerns for the employee around potential bad actors. Who's actually requesting this data? So from an employee's perspective, they need to make sure they understand who can access the data, whether through the employer or through their third-party outsourced solution. I would say that when I talk about bad actors,
I was just going to say, tell me a little bit more about these bad actors. What do you mean?
Bad actors might be a little bit of a strong term. I would say maybe entities that they wouldn't be quite as comfortable with their data being shared with. So what comes to mind for me in that respect would be debt collectors, marketing agencies, potentially data brokers. These types of entities are technically FCRA approved, but that doesn't mean that the employer should be providing the data to those entities. I would say that there should be some consideration for who would the employee be comfortable with their data being shared with? What types of entities would they be comfortable sharing their data with? Because really, you're acting on their behalf. You're delivering a benefit to them. I don't think an employee would be real comfortable if they knew that debt collectors were accessing their information from either from their employer or from their employer solution. I mean, the outsourced solution is an extension of the employer. So I think either way, the employee is going to see that as my employer is enabling debt collectors to get to my data. So that's one. And, there's a couple other considerations here. And, kind of piggybacking on that, the view of who's accessing their data, really with new privacy regulations that are out there. The other angle here is employees should have the right to know. Some of the privacy legislation, CPRA in California, that's the most stringent privacy regulation here in the U.S. today. And it mandates the employees have a right to know which requesters are accessing their data, what data is being viewed, what data is being shared and sold. So I think it's incumbent on an employer to make sure they have visibility into or understanding into, does their vendor make that information easily accessible for the employee and for them to know.
Yeah, before we jump into the data privacy laws, I want to get into that a little bit more in detail, but I think JC has some statistics he wants to share with us right now.
Yeah, absolutely. This should be a beautiful complement to exactly where we're talking right now in this discussion. Companies using automated income verification with built-in consent protocols, they're 55% more likely to meet U.S. data privacy compliance standards. 77% of employees say quick and seamless employment verification enhances their view of an employer's professionalism and digital sophistication, and 100% of employees agree that payday is the most exciting part of payroll. And lastly, 73% of employees express concern when their income verification data is handled by offshore providers, citing privacy and data risk security concerns. Wendy, back to you.
That is exactly what he was just talking about, right? Of saying like, hey, the fact that people, if I want to get a loan, I don't want to, in my HR person, know, even though I'm the HR lead, I don't want anybody to know all this stuff. Like, just verify my employment and do it quickly so that, my family isn't suffering and waiting behind the scenes. But then also, as you were saying, Donny, of being transparent and letting your employees know this is who has access to the data. I think those statistics are pretty profound. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I would say that if you're working with any vendor, and I'm not just talking employment verifications, I'm talking any HR vendor that's being entrusted with employee data, if they can't quickly and confidently answer your question around who has accessed my employee data, even whether it's broadly across your entire employee base or about a specific employee, that would raise concerns, raise concerns. It should be a very easy answer to ensure that every employee's data file, their sensitive information, is quickly trackable in terms of how it's been used, how it's been shared, how it's been sold, where it's stored. All of those criteria should be very clear.
I have a question here. Are there rules or laws that require U.S. employee financial data to be managed by, U.S. companies?
Not today, but I think many employers they're tightening requirements. Employers individually tend to be tightening requirements on offshoring any aspect of the data handling. But I will tell you that there are absolutely vendors in this space that store their data offshore, that use support for offshore service teams and support reps. And once things leave, first of all, when data leaves the confines of an employer's platform or their database, they lose some control. When that data then further propagates outside of the boundaries of the U.S., they lose even more control. The data control, data privacy requirements outside of our borders probably aren't quite as tight and definitely not as transparent as what we would expect.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. I mean, who the heck wants their information to be all over the place? And then, I want to kind of talk about streamlining HR operations. So yes, we want to make sure we're helping our employees and getting that verification as quickly as possible. In fact, I think JC has some statistics on manual employment verification and how long it takes.
Yeah, absolutely. It typically does take 1 to 5 business days, but believe it or not, Wendy, it could stretch out to weeks.
Yeah, I could see that. Why? Because it's an email somewhere, or these things called faxes. They're sitting somewhere, and then people don't know what to do with them. Is that an HR responsibility? Is it a payroll responsibility? Is it a management responsibility? Who's taking care of this? And we always have all these other fires we have to put out. So automating employment and income verification reduces that time from, an average of 1 to 5 days to less than 24 hours, dropping that turnaround time by 85%. That's huge. So Donny, from your experience, what are some practical examples of how automation has improved efficiency in the employment and income verification processes? Without mentioning any names, do you have any horror stories to share?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the stats that JC just threw out, that's the first I've heard those, and it aligns very closely with what I would expect. So when we talk to employers who are managing this process in-house today, which is, when you talk about employers of size, say over 5,000 employees, probably 70 to 80% of those organizations have outsourced this process. But those that are doing this internally, what we typically hear is on the most common response time is 48 to 72 hours. I literally just had a conversation last week with an organization whose average response time, 10 to 14 business days.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, that's definitely an outlier. But, for obvious reasons, those long turnaround times are just not good for the employee.
No, definitely not. I mean, and that, by the way, those stats were from Equifax if you want to check them out. But it's, my whole life is about employee retention, employee engagement. How are we going to recruit people? How are we going to retain them? Like, okay, we just spent all this money to recruit and retain and have these benefits and, train our managers how to give feedback. Why don't we just do this one little thing of actually helping the employee, again, pay off a bill, get a house, do whatever they need to do so they're not worried at work and they know that, boom, I need this financial situation over here. And I need my employer to let this company, whoever they are that I'm trying to buy something from, know that I'm employed, right? So that I can get approved. And ta-da, suddenly the stress gets lowered and people want to stay with you. It's really not that difficult, right, Donny?
Yeah. And to really go back and answer the question you tossed out there about, some of the experiences around examples with the impact of automation. So one, obviously the quicker turnaround. So from our perspective, our verifications of employment, they're done instantly. Verifications of income, we turn around in about 6 minutes. We have a 6 minute. Yeah. Now we turn those around in 6 minutes, and that is only because when income is requested, we actually make the verifier provide us with that proof of consent from the employee. So that signed permission slip, so to speak, we actually review every single one of those. So we turn those around on average in 6 minutes. Maybe the better way to put the context to that is if you're sitting at a car dealership on a Saturday afternoon to buy a car and you want to buy a car, that finance manager is not going to let you leave without that vehicle. If you're not able to get your income and employment verified at that point in time, there's a high degree of likelihood you're going to be assigned or you're going to receive a less favorable loan, right? They're not going to be able to adequately assess your creditworthiness, but they're not going to let you leave. They're going to find a loan that fits you even though they can't assess that. So I would say the big lift for the employee to have that quick turnaround time is to make sure that they're getting access to the appropriate types of credit. getting the right interest rates, the good interest rates, because they are gainfully employed.
Yeah. Now, you also mentioned, and thank you for that, the part about getting the employee consent. It's so important because some people that, let's face it, most businesses in the United States are small businesses. So they don't even have HR or payroll. They could be an outsourced or an ops person that's kind of handling it all. And they don't know the rules, the regulations, or just the standards of saying, hey, we should probably get the consent of the employee because that verification might not really be real. It could be from an ex-husband, an ex-spouse. And in fact, JC just messaged me over a stat that said from SHRM, nearly 40% of employment verification requests are for non-financial purposes, including background checks, immigration processing, and government compliance. So, with that alone, I want to make sure that all of my clients are definitely getting employee, acknowledgement to say, yes, I approve that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think the other thing that you touched on there, Wendy, was the types of people requesting the data. How are you ensuring that they are who they say they are? I think one thing that has to be visible, has to be in consideration for employers, is the credentialing or validation process for any outsourced solution. That's going to be a big gain versus an employer handling it internally. There's no way an in-house managed program can really vet every request coming in. But if it's an outsourced solution, those vendors should have a robust credentialing process in place. I think that's something that an employer should get a good understanding of, not only what that credentialing process looks like, but what types of entities do they approve. That's a big differentiator that you'll see a pretty wide range of answers across this industry. Some providers will say, if it's FCRA permissible, we will share the data. And again, some of the examples I mentioned earlier, debt collectors, attorneys, pawn shops, other data brokers can state a case that gets them access, that gets them approval from FCRA obligations. Not every vendor aligns with that. So again, not to get in a sales mode here, but our view on this is that we do have the right to restrict who accesses data. So we do use the FCRA obligations as guardrails, but we are much tighter than that. So we only permit financial institutes, so banks, car dealerships, property management companies, those types of organizations that an employee is pursuing some type of credit approval. We do still require consent. Our consent process is that it has to be recent. We don't honor evergreen consent. So if that consent was given 5 years ago, that's not good enough for us. So we restrict the types of entities that access our data. We also do permit government agencies, and we still put them through a credentialing process, but those government agencies can access the data. Again, they still have to attest to having employee consent, and their verification reports are done instantly. I got a little long-winded there, but I think it circles back to an employer, an HR representative for an employer should get a good understanding on the types of entities that their vendors will permit access to data.
Excellent.
60% of human resource leaders say that their automation efforts for verification and other human resources tasks typically fail due to poor integration with existing systems. This is going to lead us directly down the path of automation. Ms. Wendy, back to you.
Yeah, I want to talk about, about the poor integration with existing systems, but then also moving on to, what common mistakes do HR teams or whoever happens to be wearing the HR hat on that team make when they're, implementing the verification process, and how can we avoid these pitfalls? And Donny, I think you've already mentioned, a couple of them, to be quite honest, one of them being not getting the consent of the employee, just assuming, oh, I'm trying to do something well for the employee and I'll just get this done. And then we find out later wasn't really something that was consistent with the FCRA, like you already mentioned, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and it turned out to be somebody's ex-spouse that's just being nosy, and we went and gave it. So that's probably one mistake that people do, is not getting the consent of employees. What other mistakes do we often see companies make when they're jumping into trying to start automating verification processes for background checks, credit, immigration, as we mentioned, so on and so forth?
Yeah, I think the first big mistake or big misstep is not getting good views into the integration models that are out there. And what JC touched on is music to my ears around the integration challenges. Not because I love the challenges, because there are better models out there. So just at the highest level, this space that we are in, this employment and income verification, and really any other HR solution, so think different claims management, compliance solutions such as like I-9 or hiring tax credits, virtually every vendor in this space is using similar integration models that are about 3 decades old, where they are setting up, whether it's a file-based transmittal or maybe they have advanced a little bit and they're using API integrations. Either way, these vendors are doing what we refer to as mass data integrations. So what that means is they're pulling or accessing every employee's data every pay period. That's the standard model. So if it's a 10,000 employee organization, these vendors are getting data records on all 10,000 employees every pay period, whether that's weekly or biweekly, whether they need it or not. So in our space, this verification of employment and income space, we expect about a 20% verification rate annualized on an employee population. So in my example, a 10,000 employee organization, we would expect to fill around 2,000 verifications annually. Now, that's obviously going to change based on demographics, but at a high level, 2,000 verifications. So realistically, we should be pulling 10,000 or 2,000 records annually. If that organization has a biweekly pay cycle, they're going to send 260,000 records to that vendor or let them access 260,000 records so they can fill 2,000 verification records annually. So there are better models out there where you don't have to lose control over all those records. You don't have to let your vendor duplicate your entire database outside of your 4 walls. So again, not to turn into a sales pitch here, but I will say when I talk about a better model, there are models out there, such as ours, where we're pulling 1 record at a time, at the time it's requested, in real time, directly from the source of truth. The result of that, I know JC loves his stats, so I'm going to throw out a couple of stats here.
Love it.
At the end of the day, it's about a 99% reduction in data movement over the course of the year because we're only pulling the data when it's needed. And thereby a 99% reduction in potential data exposures.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking that as you're talking, I'm going, oh my goodness, there's so much risk for exposure and in identity theft and everything. Yep. So these are the questions you really have to vet out when you're considering hiring a company.
Absolutely. I mean, the first rule of cybersecurity is if the data doesn't need to leave your 4 walls, it shouldn't leave your 4 walls. So why would data on, let's say, 8,000 of your 10,000 employees need to be passed to a vendor if those 8,000 employees will never have a need for their data to be touched by that vendor?
Right.
Those are the types of things that I think often get overlooked early in the process. Just understanding the risks of an existing model. There's a whole set of challenges and problems with just the cumbersome nature of those types of integrations. We probably don't have enough time for that today, but I could go pretty deep down that rabbit hole and actually bore everybody to tears. But really just getting an understanding on what other models are out there and how some of the more advanced models like ours reduce risk, improve efficiency, streamline the process. And oh, by the way, it takes us about 20 to 30 calendar days to set up a new customer, with them investing about 3 to 5 hours of total time. Compare that to a file-based integration model, it's not going to be anywhere near that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of touched on it before too. And since we're just talking about this as well, about, the data privacy, there are 20 US states that have comprehensive consumer data privacy laws, each with their different consent notices and opt-out rules. But they typically do not include employee data. It's customer data. So that's why a good point when you were answering before, like there's not really a specific law about this, but I can guarantee you there's lawsuits about it. Mm-hmm. And so in HR, unfortunately, we're the unofficial lawyer too. And so we always have to be thinking about in payroll as well. Okay, even though there's not a law for it, was there a lawsuit against it? And then how do we prevent to being part of that, that lawsuit? Even if we accidentally made a mistake, it still makes us culpable. And if we win a lawsuit or not, it's going all over the internet, and it's going to help, unfortunately, affect our brand negatively, which will hurt your customers. But then from an HR aspect, hurt the capability of being able to attract new employees and then retain those employees. Any comments on that?
Yeah, actually, I do have a couple comments, Wendy. So you're correct. Most of the data privacy legislation excludes employee data. California is an exception to that, though. CPRA does say employee data.
Of course.
Yeah, and honestly, from our perspective, we like that. We are proponents for the privacy legislation. We think it's good for the employees. We support it. We've designed our model to be optimized for data privacy. Here's the comment, though. Here's the really scary thing to think about, specific to those employers that meet the requirements to be under the obligation of CPRA out in California. Most of the other vendors in our space, the largest providers in our space, have sought and obtained exemption to the CPRA regulation. They got the exemption under the premise of managing data under FCRA regulation. So that gets them exemption from the CPRA. The scary part of this is there's a lot of unknowns. What does that mean for the employer? The employers are still beholden to the CPRA regulation. They are enabling access to that employee data to vendors who are not under those same obligations. So if something were to happen, there's a failure to be compliant, whose shoulders does that fall on? And that's not an answer that we have today. Until there's precedent set, nobody's willing to give a solid answer. But to me, it's a question that shouldn't even need to be posed. If I was making a decision on the behalf of an employer, I would want to work with a vendor who has skin in the game, that's under the same obligatory requirements that my organization is. So that's another piece I would say that should be part of the any vendor assessment, is understanding, do they adhere to the same obligations when it comes to privacy oversight as your organization. So I think that's meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those folks that are wondering what CPRA stands for, it's the California Privacy Rights Act. It's also known as Proposition 24. So he's specifically referring to California. But California is usually the trendsetter, of saying, okay, we're going to start a rule. And then other states similar to California across the country then say we're going to do the same thing. I have a quick question off of that particular. What if I just had one employee in California, remote or in person? Does that mean I have to follow that rule for all the employees or just that one employee?
I don't think you would have to follow it for the one employee. There are some minimum employment and revenue-based requirements in the state of California. I think it's like $25 million a year in annual revenue in the state of California. Don't necessarily fully quote me on that because I'm trying to go off of memory, but it is something along those lines. So it's not necessarily something that's going to drive the small businesses out there, but any type of mid-market or enterprise customers absolutely going to be beholden to those obligations. And then typically, as an organization from a global risk and compliance perspective, they're typically going to manage their employee base to the tightest requirements. So what we see often is an organization that is under the scope of the California Privacy Rights Act, they just put all of their employees kind of under the same level of expectation because it's easier rather than trying to manage disparate sets of obligations.
All right.
Over 60% of U.S. organizations struggle to keep up with evolving data and privacy laws. It leads to increased risk in handling sensitive human resource data like employment and income records. And organizations that implement privacy by design principles inside their HR tech systems, they are 2.3 times more likely to stay compliant with evolving data privacy laws. Back to you.
I would give a round of applause on that. Privacy by design is something that we wholeheartedly support for many reasons, but there's layers upon layers of privacy by design steps and processes that align with what we do. So selfishly, we support it, but it's because we think it's the right thing to do for that employee data.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with you. Again, just going back to the fact that even if you don't have an HR department, even if you don't have a payroll department, even if it's outsourced or you're too small to, really need that, whoever is running payroll, whoever is acting as HR, the business owner, the ops person, they need to understand privacy. They need to understand the laws, but not just the laws, just the concept of privacy in the workplace, and that today's workers expect privacy. And if you don't give it to them, they're not going to stick around, and they're going to tell everybody that will listen about, the lack of privacy and the data exchange, going on. So it's super, super important for us to understand, employment and income verification systems, whether you're doing it manually or if you're doing it automated, You need to make sure you're keeping up with the times, with the expectations, and not holding your employee back by, dilly-dallying around. So before we wrap up, can you share any, final best practices for ensuring that the verification systems remain compliant with current data privacy laws? Of course, that means you're going to be listening to our podcast and finding more information. But other than that.
Yes, that is the key. Listen to this podcast every time. But yeah, I think we've touched on most of the themes. I would say some of the best practices are just really to work with your vendors to make sure that there is a process to minimize the flow of data. If there is an opportunity to restrict the transmittal of data that's not necessarily under the contract, you should put that in place. I would say it's also imperative to get a clear understanding around their data retention practices. So what data is stored, how and where is it stored, how long do they keep it? And I've touched on it a few times, but understand their practices around who they share information with, what do they deem as permissible, what levels of detail do they show, what is their practice around employee consent, how do they manage that, how do they track it, how do they report it? And then, I would say just in a nutshell, the best way to probably go about that, and we've seen this ramp up a lot in the last 18 months, that is employers having data protection agreements, data framework agreements, where you as the employer should be assertive and put your expectations out there. Don't let the vendor dictate how they're going to access the data, how they're going to store the data, how they're going to use the data. You have a say in this. It's ultimately your solution. So those would be my recommendations.
I think they're amazing recommendations. Policies are important, practices are important. So also remember to train your managers on what they can and cannot say to other employees. First of all, other employees, and then who should be answering these questions about employment and income verification. So it's 100% interesting that we're on the same page for that, even though we absolutely don't do, close to the same thing, but we rely on each other. So Donny Phillips, Director of Partnerships at Vault Verify. I love everything that you said here today. How can our listeners connect with you?
Yeah, I'd say the easiest path to get in touch with us is to hit our website, which is simply vaultverify.com. There's tons of resources out there in terms of our model, how we go about things. There's the Contact Us page. Actually, if you hit the partners link, my contact information is out there. I run all the partners for Vault Verify. So yeah, if you have questions, if you want to dig into this any further, we're here. We're happy to help. We love having the conversations. And ultimately, we'd love to bring on more happy customers.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it. This is a reminder to our listeners that if you listen to this podcast via the HR Empowerment website, you can also receive HRCI and SHRM credits. Simply go to auroratrainingadvantage.com and look for the training tab. Hit the drop down, and then there's a podcast selection. I hope this podcast has been beneficial and helpful to you. I will include the website and Donny's LinkedIn in the podcast explanation. Take care, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Take care, Donny.
You too. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for joining the HR Empowerment Podcast, brought to you by Aurora Training Advantage. We hope you've gained new insight and strategies to navigate the HR profession. We look forward to you joining us again on the HR Empowerment Podcast.